heavy price and ensure that we pass it on to the next generation. So I implore, Madam Speaker, every American to get engaged in this noble fight for the future of our country, for our children, and for our grandchildren. My favorite modern-day president, President Reagan, said it this way: freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We did not pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for and passed on for them to do the same. Or one day, in our sunset years, we will tell our children and our children's children what it was once like in America, where men were free. Madam Speaker, indeed, we will meet our deep obligation to the next generation of Americans, and as we come through this Veterans Day, may God watch over our veterans, our troops who stand watch tonight, and may God forever bless the United States of America. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to again thank our leader, Nancy Pelosi, and the Democratic Caucus for allowing the Congressional Black Caucus to have this hour, this special order hour once again. Before I begin my discussion today, though, I want to take this opportunity to wish a very happy birthday to my daughter, Karita Green. I'm blessed to have 2 wonderful daughters and 4 fantastic grandchildren who I was able to spend the past weekend with as we celebrated Kobe's, one of my grandson's, 5th birthday. I also want to extend congratulations to the federal team that's now in place in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Congratulations to our new District Court Judge, Wilma A. Lewis, who joins Chief Judge Curtis Gomez and Senior Sitting Judge Raymond Finch in the District Court of the Virgin Islands. To congratulate U.S. Attorney Ronald W. Sharp, who had his investiture this morning, and also Chief Marshal Cheryl Jacobs, who was sworn in about 2 weeks ago. We welcome all of them and thank President Obama and Attorney General Holder for their nominations and the Senate for their timely confirmation. And let me once again thank all of those men and women who have served in our nation's armed forces and those who serve today for their courage and their sacrifice, and I also want to thank their families who serve and sacrifice along with them. We in the Congressional Black Caucus, and indeed I think the entire Congress, looks forward also to sometime in the not-too-distant future to honor the Mumford Marines with a well-deserved and long-overdue Congressional Gold Medal. But this evening, Madam Speaker, the Congressional Black Caucus continues our focus on the need for jobs and to reiterate the call for the leadership of this Congress to bring legislation to the floor that would create jobs. But tonight we also want to call our attention to the continuing plight of the poor in this country and how the budget and other battles that have been fought on the floor of this House and over in the Senate have been hurting them, and what is at stake for them also if the Super Committee does not come to a balanced agreement that would reduce the deficit by $1.2 trillion or more, and I would say hopefully more. Earlier this month, 9 members of the House joined the Fighting Poverty with Faith initiative and took the food stamp challenge. We agreed to live on what is the average food stamp allotment for a week, $31.50, and I can tell you that it is not easy. There are over 48 million Americans today in this 48 million Americans who are food insecure. More than 16 million children live in households that are food insecure in the richest country in the world. Millions face hunger every day in this country, a fact that we should all be ashamed of. These numbers are only getting worse, not just because of the recession, but because almost all of the growth and wealth in the past decade went to the top 10% of people in this country. For most Americans, their income dropped. The incomes really crashed, and the gap between rich and poor got wider. a dangerous trend for a country already struggling to maintain its leadership in the world, something everyone should want to do everything in our power to maintain. For all of our 40 years of existence, the goal of the Congressional Black Caucus has been to close the gaps that leave some communities behind or some out altogether, to close the income gap, the job gap, the housing gap, the health gap, the education gap, and all of the disparities that have been so doggedly persistent for some communities. Not because those on the losing side didn't want them to change or didn't work for change, but because the opportunity too often was just not there. Colleagues, America is the land of opportunity, and all of us, not just the 43 members of the Congressional Black Caucus, but all 441, or really all 541, need to be working together to make sure that it is for all and not just for some. This country was founded on the principle that all men and women are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights, not to be separated from us, inalienable rights, the right to liberty, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Many times, even when we pass programs that should have helped, they don't reach communities that need them most. Those communities, in some cases, are not prepared to compete, or they may not be priorities in their state for the governors of those states, who often get to decide where those programs go. And that's why our assistant leader, James Clyburn, joined with Congressman Rangel to develop the 10-20-30 program, an initiative that they've taken to the White House and to the Republican as well as the Democratic leadership. Under this initiative, which seeks to help out the most chronically distressed communities, 10% of all funding and programs would go to communities with 20% or higher poverty levels for 30 or more years. And it may surprise everyone, but 2/3 of all of the jurisdictions that would qualify for that 10% are in Republican districts. I think if it were under any other administration, or if it were proposed by someone on the other side of the aisle, perhaps this would have been passed long ago. But today, those communities, not all of which are racial and ethnic minority in makeup, many are, but not all are, would continue to suffer and in essence be denied those inalienable rights. And that's not the country that we know and love. At our annual legislative conference in September, we heard from researchers who reported on persistent poverty and its impact on health and the quality of life in the communities that are chronically distressed. Their report tracked the stubborn persistence of concentrated poverty in U.S. metropolitan areas over a period of nearly 40 years. Neighborhoods with poverty rates above 30% have been recognized as places with few opportunities for employment and education, high levels of disinvestment and crime, and meager civic participation. Living in such neighborhoods over extended periods of time reduces the life chances of children, whether their families are poor or not. The report also looked more deeply at a subset of urban neighborhoods that can be characterized as the original ghetto. Extensive areas whose cores were almost exclusively non-white and poor in 1970. The report showed that the nation continues to suffer from racially and economically divided cities, undercutting efforts to reach important goals for our country, for health, for education, for employment, and civic engagement. More specifically, that report found that concentrated poverty had risen substantially since 2000. About 1 in 11 residents of American metropolitan areas, or 22.3 million people, now live in a neighborhood where 30% or more of their neighbors live in poverty. Such neighborhoods suffer from private sector disinvestment, poor public services and schools, and unacceptable levels of exposure to crime, natural hazards, and pollution. The number of people in high-poverty neighborhoods increased nearly 5 million, by 5 million people since 2000, when 18.4 million metropolitan residents, 7.9% of the total, lived in high-poverty neighborhoods. The rise since 2000 is a significant setback compared with the progress in the 1990s. The number of people in high poverty neighborhoods stabilized in the 1990s, and the concentrated poverty rate fell, fueling optimism that place-based initiatives and rising prosperity were reversing a crisis that had grown dire in the 1980s. Today, however, it appears that the improvement of the 1990s was just a temporary respite. The increase in the number of Americans living in high poverty neighborhoods tracks directly with the nation's increasing poverty rate. Between 2000 and 2009, the number of people in poverty grew by 10 million, from 33 million to 43 million, raising the poverty rate from 11.3% to 14.3% in 2009. Today, it's over 15%. And we all have seen the Pew report, which showed that white wealth is 20 times more than African American wealth and 18 times more than Hispanic wealth, and that more African Americans live in extreme poverty. That is a very bad prognosis, if it continues, for the economic health of our nation. Also, everyone knows that I'm a family doctor by training that I received right here in the nation's capital at George Washington University School of Medicine and Howard University Medical Center. So the health of my fellow Americans is very important to me. And so I have to just point out that poverty is a sure prescription for poor health and for premature preventable disability and death. Just eliminating poverty alone would improve the health of millions and the terrible health standing of our country, which is an embarrassment. Or, let me quote one of our Surgeon Generals, an affront to the genius of American medicine and to the ideals of our country, as was said by former Surgeon General Margaret Heckler back in 1985, and it continues to be today. As many have said, the American dream has become a nightmare for too many in this country, including those who recently came in pursuit of it, our immigrant community. The Rebuild American Dream movement and many of the Occupy Wall Street protests are all about making it a good dream again, but not just a dream, but an opportunity to make it a reality. As quiet as it's kept, and we Democrats have really been too quiet, Democrats have always been about keeping the American dream alive for everyone who lives and who comes to this country, for making opportunity available to all, for solid education, for good health, a decent job, a home in a safe neighborhood, and a secure retirement. We have never lost sight of or lost faith in this. And we continue to fight for it, despite the big money, opposition, and the special interests who think they will win out in the end. But they won't, because we are on the side of the American people, and they will always side with what is in their best interest and in the best interest of our country. Before we went out on our break, one more break than we needed, Congresswoman Barbara Lee introduced H.R. 3300, the Half in 10 Act of 2011, which proposes to cut poverty in half within the next 10 years. In 2008, the House Concurrent Resolution 198 unanimously passed Congress and committed us to doing just that, cutting poverty in half. The new bill provides us with a framework for doing it, and we need to honor the commitment that we made in 2008 and pass the bill, H.R. 3300. The Half in 10 Act would establish a federal interagency working group on reducing poverty. The working group will develop and implement a national plan to reduce poverty in half in 10 years while working to eliminate extreme poverty that I talked about earlier, child poverty, and the historic disparity in poverty rates in communities of color. The working group will improve how we collect data on those who are in poverty and near poverty and make regular reports on their progress so that Congress and the American people can better understand the impact of our policies and programs and make more informed decisions about how we as a people treat our most vulnerable. The working group will be charged with developing and implementing a national plan on poverty with 4 distinct but interrelated goals. 1, to reduce the national poverty rate in half in 10 years. 2, to eliminate extreme poverty, income under 50% of poverty, 3, to eliminate child poverty, and 4, to eliminate the historic disparity in poverty rates in communities of color. That working group would consult with experts across all relevant federal agencies as well as outside poverty groups who work directly with those most affected by those federal programs so that we can develop a comprehensive and far-reaching and sustainable plan. And I urge, I really want to thank Congresswoman Barbara Lee, our former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, for her work on eliminating poverty, for her leadership of the Out of Poverty Caucus, and for introducing H.R. 3300. We have another bill that will soon be introduced by Congresswoman Gwen Moore, which also speaks to poverty. She's preparing a bill that would reform TANF, and I think everyone would agree that TANF has not really worked as it was intended to. As we look at it, it's created a permanent underclass. Block grants are locked in at 1994 levels. Many who move off of assistance after 5 years still don't have jobs and they don't have child care. The rise in food stamp usage shows that where those pushed off of assistance have gone. The average age of TANF, the TANF recipient, is 7.8 years of age. 20% of children live in abject poverty in this country. It's damaged the social safety net that was meant to respond to the counter-cyclical nature of the economy when there's a recession. It's supposed to be that last help. So the bill is still being drafted, but some of the things that it would do would it would stipulate that the #1 goal of TANF is child poverty reduction. It would stop the clock during a recession. It would guarantee child care for TANF work-eligible recipients. It would lift all-time limits on work participation requirements and the 30% state cap on education. And it would adjust the federal work participation requirements so that states could get credit when individuals with disabilities participate in work-related activities, even if the nature of those activities or the number of hours do not match the standard TANF requirements. Those are just some of the things that we expect to have go into the bill. And again, in addition to H.R. 3300, when Congresswoman Gwen Moore introduces her TANF reform bill, we hope that all of our colleagues will support it. There's also an elephant in this room and every room in Congress, and that's, of course, the deficit cutting proposal that the super committee is responsible for bringing forth in about 9 days. Actually, it would be more than a proposal because we would have to vote on it as it is, just up or down, no amendments. We hear that there will more than likely, within those 9 days, be an agreement. And if there's any hope for fair and balanced agreement, it's because we know that the House members that the caucus, the Democratic caucus, have placed on that committee will work to ensure that it is. And those are our Assistant Leader Jim Clyburn, Vice Chair of the caucus Xavier Becerra, and our Budget Chair Chris Van Hollen. But you know, we've said over and over again that this plan needs to include further extension of unemployment benefits, which is something that has been demonstrated over and over again is a guaranteed stimulus for the recession that we are not yet out of. But it also, of course, provides a needed bridge until we can get this Congress to create jobs again. It's been over 300 days, and we still have yet to see the Republican leadership produce and enact a jobs agenda for this country, something that we all know is so badly needed. And just to talk about where we are, in the third quarter of 2011, 31.8% of 14 million Americans who are out of work have been so for more than a year. That amounts to 4.4 million people. Older workers are more likely to remain out of work for a year or longer. 43% of unemployed workers older than 55 had been out of work for at least a year. Although those with more education are less likely to lose jobs, once unemployed, long-term joblessness is distributed across all educational levels, and we keep hearing about those who might have a job saying, if you're jobless, don't apply. Now, that just does not make any sense. And unemployment cuts across every industry and occupation. More than 20% of unemployed workers in every industry had been out of work for a year or longer. And in mining, manufacturing, transportation, utilities, financial activities, the percentage of workers who've been jobless for a year or longer is over 40%. We cannot get out of this recession without jobs. So again, we call on the leadership of this body to enact a jobs agenda. We, the Democrats, have proposed and requested in the strongest way possible that the American Jobs Act be a part of the Super Committee's report. In itself, because of the tax and other revenue it would generate, is an important part of reducing our deficit. We also want other revenues to be a part of that agreement. This is not in any way class warfare. The poor and the middle class have already given up much, have made major concessions and sacrifices. And in the interest of saving our country, they would likely do more up to a point. But now it's time for everyone else to give. It's the patriotic thing to do. Unless some or even all of the Bush tax cuts, which were meant only to be temporary and should have expired already, unless they are allowed to expire, the majority of the deficit will come out of programs that would help the middle class and the poor. The country I pledge allegiance to is a fair country. The Congress has the sacred responsibility to keep it fair and with liberty and justice for all. If no agreement is reached, or if the House and Senate fail to pass whatever agreement that is reached, mandatory across-the-board cuts will be imposed. And the President has already said he will prevent any attempts to stop the mandatory cuts from taking place, and I hope that that threat extends to mandatory defense cuts, because what we keep hearing is that those defense cuts will just not ever happen. And if defense is spared, the mandatory discretionary cuts would further come out of programs that would help the poor and the middle class and would hurt them even more than some of the budget agreements we've already reached. Some of the cuts that this Congress have already made would hurt the poor and hurt jobs. And just in 2011, 250 programs were cut. They probably eliminated about 370,000 jobs. Those are just some of the things we've already lost. Almost 60,000 jobs lost from the spring budget cuts to federal government in 3 areas, with secondary impact on a wide array of businesses ranging from automobile producers to local restaurants and dry cleaning establishments. Federal support for law enforcement, environmental cleanup of nuclear weapons production facilities, and General Services Administration Federal Buildings Fund. Those are some of the cuts that have just wiped out jobs at a time when we need to be creating them. So we need to make sure that we allow our economy to grow. We need to continue or begin to invest in education and health care, and yes, renewable energy and innovation of all kinds. The only way we can do this is with a big agreement, but one that includes far more revenue than the mere $300 billion that is now on the table. So we want balance and fairness from the Super Committee. We want a jobs agenda enacted. We want to see the American Jobs Act be a part of it. We want to see that unemployment the unemployment payments are continued and extended beyond where they are today. And we want to go further to make sure that poverty is reduced in our country. Because again, over 16 million children in this country are going hungry every day and living in poverty. And that is something that any country worth its salt should never tolerate. I see that I'm joined by one of my colleagues, Congressman Sheila Jackson Lee, and if she would like to, I'd like to yield her such time as she might consume.
I thank the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, particularly for her leadership, and I'm delighted to join her in what I think is an enormously important discussion. Oftentimes, Congresswoman, we don't get a chance to have this kind of discussion when we're debating bills on the floor of the House. So let me first of all add again to your statistics. The more we can recite for people what the problem is, the better off we are. So you will see us standing over the next couple of days and weeks, and isn't it interesting as we're approaching Thanksgiving and then the Christmas holiday for many of us, and holidays in different names, Hanukkah for many others, and many other kinds of celebratory holidays that call upon fellowship and food, to realize how many are impoverished in this nation. And so I'm delighted to stand with the Congressional Black Caucus, our friend Congresswoman Barbara Lee, our chairperson, Chairman Cleaver, and yourself, to firmly stand committed to combating poverty, eliminating hunger, and providing health insurance for all citizens. And let me just say, in light of that, the Supreme Court indicating that they will take up the health care bill, but I'm going to join some pundits and take a risk and say that it's going to be upheld. I know there are a lot of rubbing of the hands and excitement because they see in the eyesight the death knell for the Affordable Care Act. But the good news is that one of the judges that upheld the Affordable Care Act was a conservative judge who analyzed our right to require individuals to have insurance for the greater good. That's not the legal interpretation. And I believe there is sufficient numbers on the court that will look beyond politics and realize that the heavy burden of health care is a heavy burden on the economy. And if you are a conservative, you will look more closely at individual responsibility. That's what the Affordable Care Act is, along with preventative care, protecting children. So I'm going to be an optimist, and I'm looking forward to the Supreme Court's decision. But our numbers show 1 of every 6 Americans are living in poverty, a total of 46.2 million people. This is the highest number in 17 years in a country with so many resources. And you've heard me say this before. Our country is not broke. It can belt-tighten. It can move dollars around. And I'm glad that the Congressional Black Caucus that is talking about create, protect, and rebuild has the answers. Let me just say that children represent a disproportionate amount of the United States poor population. And I chair the Congressional Children's Caucus. In 2008, there were 15.45 million impoverished children in the nation, 20.7% of America's youth. The Kaiser Family Foundation estimates that there are currently 5.6 million Texans living in poverty. 2.2 million of them are children, and that 17.4% of households in the state struggle with food insecurity. And in my district alone, the 18th Congressional District, a very historic district, there are 190,000 people living below the poverty line. The highest number of people living in poverty in 17 years, and then we are thinking about cutting vital social services, such as the Supplemental Excess SNAP program that fed 3.9 million residents of Texas in April 2011, the WIC program. And the Census Bureau also reported that there are 49.9 million people in the country without health insurance. We've already discussed that. And Texas happens to be the state with the highest number. Compound all of that, and you're literally taking the front door, if there is one, opening the door, and kicking people to the street. And I just want to deviate for a moment as I just go over some very important aspects that I think, joining with the Congressional Black Caucus, that if they would only listen, if you would only listen, I believe would move us on a pathway of creating jobs, just as we spoke about in the jobs tour that we participated in this summer. But I want to be very clear. The Second Mile in Pennsylvania was labeled as an organization that dealt with at-risk children. Those are poor children. And some might ask, where is she going here? They are the most vulnerable. They are the most needy. And because those children were vulnerable, because those parents were vulnerable, because they were looking for relief, looking for a child to have some sort of, if you will, activity and comfort, maybe even food. I'm sure those programs and trips out of town might have also had resources that children do not have. When a child is vulnerable, they become a target for the most heinous of acts. And if I might deviate and indicate that I intend to introduce legislation on 2 counts. One, to suspend any federal funding to any entity, academic, nonprofit, states and local government, prosecutor's office, that have covered up and not prosecuted or have not reported sexual abuse of a child, excluding, if it is an academic institution, funding for scholarships and Pell Grants. And to also indicate funding, ramping up funding for the Department of Justice for anyone who carries a child over state lines for the intent of sexually abusing a child. What an untoward national image and international image we have just gotten. Don't worry about football. I'm not interested in the state. I'm not interested in a particular academic institution. I'm not pointing fingers. I don't know the coach's name. I just know that in the course of the activity of this alleged perpetrator, there may be many more vulnerable, poor children, which we're talking about tonight, the most impoverished, and that one person, among others, saw a physical sexual act and did nothing about it. And so poverty is not only the family and not having enough to eat, maybe not having clothing, maybe not having a place to live, but it also means it puts a child in the most horrible, horrific of conditions, almost to the extent, even though you would say that the predator is sick, but it puts that vulnerable child, because that parent may be vulnerable, that parent may not be home, they may be a loving parent, they may be struggling with 3 jobs, and they need a place for their child. The child may need the comfort and nurturing of an adult, and that child then becomes a victim. So don't think that poverty, we're standing here and arguing against poverty just to be arguing it. It is a systemic atmosphere and condition that will allow you to be victimized. Let me go to the super committee as I talk about what the CBC, Congressional Black Caucus, is looking at. I will follow the quotes of some I have heard who testified before the committee. I had the privilege of sitting in on one meeting, not very long, and I think they are dedicated members of Congress. But we must know that this is not in the regular order. This was out of the order, and it came about through the forced need to lift the debt ceiling. In essence, we were taken hostage. Yes, so frankly, I'm going to suggest that the super committee yield. They can go through the 23rd, but in essence accept the inevitable, that there will be no agreement, and that this Congress come back in 2012, because we have until 2013 for the sequestration, come back in 2012 and do our business and respond to the suggestions of the Congressional Black Caucus and legislation that many of us have introduced to create jobs, to balance the revenue, and do our work. And so I want to suggest that there are many programs. Neighborhood stabilization program has been touted all over America. What it does is it brings dollars into depressed areas where these vulnerable children live, and it provides stabilization dollars, making good on 100,000 properties. It was $7 billion, and it allows these properties to be restored for families. In the course of doing that, you create jobs, and you don't have these big signs that say foreclosure. And then, of course, the National Housing Trust. The Congress can provide at least $1 billion to fund the National Housing Trust, a mechanism for affordable housing. When a child has a room and a light and a desk and a bed, and that family feels comfortable, they are less vulnerable to sexual predators, to not having resources, to being thrown to the wolves, if you will, and it will create 15,000 jobs. Unemployment insurance that many of us have worked on and joined Congressman Lee and Scott to extend to the 99ers and to make sure that they can put bread on their table, pay their light bill, get gas to go look for a job. It will save 500,000 jobs. 500,000 jobs. Why is no one listening? It's a simple process. And has anyone heard of a country moving forward without investment in its people? And that's what we are arguing. Very quickly, we've supported this for so long, no one will listen. Everybody that is outsourcing is taxed. And that will generate resources that will allow us to invest back into the Treasury. Then we can invest in the National Housing Trust. We can invest in the Neighborhood Stabilization Program. We can invest in the 99ers. We can provide money to those who are in need. Give a tax holiday for the first $20,000 on the payroll tax, which would provide the opportunity for small businesses and put income in, if you will, the pockets of many who are in need, who week to week make ends meet and are very much in need of that. As well, to help those who have been chronically unemployed, to not discriminate against them, but to give a payroll tax in order to hire the chronically unemployed. So when they see help wanted, they'll be excited about hiring someone because they have that benefit. By the way, can we make an announcement here? We're not broke. Companies have trillions of dollars in their bank accounts, and so do the banks. But they keep saying to us they're afraid to invest and let the money go because it's not a stable economy. How much louder do I have to say it's a chicken and egg? Hire people. That's a stable economy. They invest back into the economy. They begin to buy things. Then you begin to manufacture. It's a chicken and egg. It's a cart and a horse.
Absolutely.
Reestablish manufacturing. If manufacturing makes things, we've got to buy things. How do you buy things? You have money to buy it. And I've been supporting this for a very long time, part of the Manufacturing Caucus. In addition, it is very important that we do as the WPA did during the time of the horrible aftermath of the Depression, and the Workforce Investment Act would be assisting 8 million people and give all of these people a chance to fix the infrastructure all across America. Cars will stop going into potholes, bridges will stop having cracks in them, and we will be able to put people to work. TANF, if it was fully funded and it had an emergency contingency fund that many of us have been speaking about, this would provide, make available to create temporary jobs for adults and summer jobs, but more importantly, it would create 240,000 jobs. And the same thing with the infrastructure. Again, how many people have traveled with limited amount of gas, but traveled over bridges and freeways and found them in disrepair? This is a simple process.
Absolutely.
And I would argue vigorously that it is disappointing that we have not been listened to, and members of the Congressional Black Caucus and the Democratic Caucus, and even today the Super Committee is speaking about not fulfilling the promise of putting the revenue on the table necessary to counter the cuts. I frankly don't want sequestration. The vulnerable will be hit the hardest with all of the cuts that are pointed toward Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, food stamps, and others that they allege that are protected, but I would argue that aspects of it are not. I made a public commitment to my veterans on last Friday that I would not allow from my vote and my support 1 iota of veterans benefits to be cut. I'm so tired of people talking about that we're not willing to look at Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. No, I am not willing to look at it as it has been proposed by my Republican friends. They know full well how they can cut this. They can follow the Affordable Care Act and close the donut hole on Medicare Part D, the most expensive, heinous, insulting affront to spending money in the United States of America that was voted on under a Republican majority, Medicare Part D that all seniors hate. Our Affordable Care Act, if allowed to be implemented, would close the donut hole. That's one way of doing it, and seniors would jump for joy. In addition, if you start talking about provider benefits, I'm going to publicly say I oppose it. Why? Because I cannot trust the knife. What does the knife do? It goes in and slashes hospitals and home care and others possibly, and when you slash it, you do jeopardize seniors who are in hospitals. We have to find a way to cut the waste, fraud, and abuse, and we've determined that waste, fraud, and abuse can save us billions of dollars. So out of my lips, I will not support cutting Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security or discretionary funding. I will support the creation of 8 million jobs. I will support investing in America's people. I will support getting rid of at-risk children, meaning not getting rid of them, their condition, so that we don't have to find at-risk children. What a disgrace that we take that in such a way that we categorize. These are at-risk children. These are poor children, and we just accept it. They're numbers. Well, at-risk children are impoverished, malnourished, don't have good health care, and are victims. And they can be victims of the most heinous sexual predator story act of our recent times. Even we've heard of the faith institution that has been under such siege, who have made changes. The Catholic Church spoke out today because it is a disease, it is an epidemic, but it comes out of poverty and vulnerability. And if we don't cut out the vulnerability of our children and families, and in this great country, even the Bible says the poor will always be with us, but they also say be busy until we come. And that means we should be busy till the Lord comes. For those of us who believe, should be busy until he comes, making the corrections that we have to make. So I want to thank the gentlelady for allowing me to join her and to express, as a chairwoman of the Congressional Children's Caucus, the work that should be done, the work that we've done on issues of bullying and obesity and nutrition and areas like that are added to this work that has been done by the Congressional Black Caucus. And I just simply say, is anybody listening? Because we have the solution. And if they would only listen, 8 million jobs, children who are protected, and families who can get back on their feet and begin to invest back in this country. With that, I yield back to the gentlelady.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman Jackson Lee, for joining us, and thank you for the work that you do on the Judiciary Committee, and especially for your strong defense of children and the rights of children and the protection of children in this country. And we look forward to the introduction of your bills as well, and we ask for the support of our colleagues for them, both as co-sponsors and when they get to the floor. So thank you for joining us. We've both. You wanted to say something else?
If I might, as I close, I did mention education because many of us know, and thank the gentlelady for yielding just for a moment. Many of us know that we are facing huge cuts in education. Again, who does it hit? The vulnerable children in public schools. And I just have to, before I leave the microphone, mention the North Forest Independent School District, the only majority-minority school district left in the state of Texas, targeted for closing, not because it's not welcomed by parents, teachers, and others, but because the state simply wants to be on a budget-cutting trip, if you will. And I leave the podium by saying to my governor, Governor Perry, as I've talked about impoverished children, don't cut, don't close, and don't condemn children who are trying to learning in North Forest Independent School District. And to my colleagues, education creates jobs. I didn't mention the teachers, but also it invests in our children. I thank the gentlelady for yielding to me. Thank you.
And thank you for the optimism about the outcome of the Affordable Care Act at the Supreme Court. I wish I share your optimism, but we'll take that as a very positive outlook on the outcome, and I hope that indeed your predictions are correct. I want to ask, Madam Speaker, unanimous consent or general leave that all members may have 5 legislative days to present statements on the material of this special order, and also 5 legislative days for us to revise and extend our remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of the special order this evening.
Without objection.
Thank you. And with no further speakers, Madam Speaker, I will. You have one more? Okay.
The
Yes.
gentlelady yields back the balance of her time.
Yes, I'm ready to yield back the balance of my time. Thanks.
I said it. I don't need to say it again, right? Yes, I do need to say it again. I do.
That you'll go with that as soon as he looks up, you can go with that sheet. I thought she was going to move to adjourn, and that would be awkward, so I didn't want to.
Oh.
You can do it now.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomer, is recognized for 30 minutes.
Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Thanks.
It is interesting to see the way the negotiations with the super committee are playing out. Some of us didn't vote for the debt ceiling bill. I know in my own case I didn't vote for it because I read it. I was concerned it was not a good idea. Countries should not put their national security as a bargaining chip on the table. National security is important to everyone on both sides of the aisle. It should never be used as a bargaining chip, whether or not we're going to devastate it. On the other side, the defense would be devastated at the same time Medicare would be devastated. If the super committee's recommendations are not approved by at least 7 of the 12, and then Congress does not pass them into law. Medicare gets cut, and so does the national security get devastated. So who stands to win, who stands to lose in that scenario? Well, we know that when the what commonly referred to as Obamacare, I don't even remember the real name, when that got passed, ARP indicates, hey, that's a good idea. Even though it had $500 billion in cuts to Medicare, I couldn't believe that some of the groups that endorsed that bill did endorse it. Because, for one, it had $500 billion in cuts to Medicare. You know, we got ARP stirring up seniors right now. Send in the petition, tell them you don't want any cuts to Medicare, that you're a member of ARP, and I appreciated those petitions very much. Those people that felt Medicare shouldn't have been cut should have been telling that to ARP back when they were thinking that the Obamacare was a good idea. It wasn't then, it's not now, and it won't be if it kicks into effect fully and people start having rationed care. So what would take people's minds off the fact that the President's pride and joy, his health care bill, cut $500 billion from Medicare, and Republicans didn't support it, didn't think it was a good idea? That's 100% a Democratic bill that was ramrodded through with most of the country against it. So the President has to carry that mantle, as do the leaders in charge at that time, the people that were in the majority in the House that time under Speaker Pelosi, as she pushed it through and commenting that we needed to pass it so we could find out what was in it. Well, I had read it. I knew what was in it and knew it was a disaster waiting to happen. I knew that it hurt seniors badly. So we come back again to this super committee. What does Leader Reid and the Senate Democrats, even House Democrats, what do they have to gain if the super committee's proposals are not adopted. Well, there'll be massive cuts to security, and there'll be massive cuts to Medicare, and that will mean, from a political standpoint, that those same people that rammed through Obamacare against the country's will then be able to say before next year's election, look what happened. Republicans caused a massive cut to Medicare. They're the ones to blame. They'll be able to take people's minds off the fact that Obamacare was a $500 billion cut to Medicare to our seniors that will result in them having rationed care, getting on long lists before they can get treated, like happens in England, like happens in Canada. You get on a list to get your mammogram, get on a list if there's cancer there to have it biopsied, or if there's a lump, have it biopsied, get on a list, to have therapy of some kind, whether it's surgery, whether it's radiation, chemo, whatever, of whatever kind of cancer it is. You get on a list. I've mentioned before, a man originally from Canada who said his father died because he was on a list to have a bypass surgery for 2 years. If he'd been in the U.S., his son said he'd still be alive, but he was in Canada, and because they have the socialized medicine program basically embraced by Obamacare, then you were going to end up on lists. It's what happens when the government's completely in charge of health care. Doesn't have to be like that. When you look at the amount that the federal government and state government spend on Medicare and Medicaid, divided by the number of households in the country, we've gotten a bunch of different numbers, but it appears that it may be around $25,000 for every household on Medicare and Medicaid. Between $20,000 and $30,000 just to pay for health insurance. We'd be far better off buying them a high deductible policy and giving them cash money in an HSA, health savings account, with a debit card they control. They decide what doctor they go to. They decide what hospital they go to. They decide whether they want this medicine or that medicine. And when they go through, if they go through the amount of the high deductible, that's all the money to cover that's in their health savings account, then their insurance kicks in. And we finally get the insurance companies out of the insurance or out of the health management business and back into the health insurance business. Because right now we don't really have any health insurance companies. We got health management companies. I want to go back to having health insurance companies. Insurance is when someone pays a small amount monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, annually, to insure against some unforeseen event, either a catastrophic disease or accident. It's unforeseen. Don't know if it's going to happen. Don't know if you're going to run up health expenses to that kind of high mark. So you got an insurance policy to insure against that unforeseen event or disease. That's insurance. If we don't get the insurance companies back in the business of insurance instead of management, they may not be around, because there'll always be people that want to push something like the president did last year. Most of us, I think, don't want the government telling us what medication we can have, what doctor we can see, why we can't see a doctor, why we're going to have to pay through the nose, why we'll have to buy an additional insurance policy to cover all the gaping holes that Medicare, Medicaid leave. it would be nice if people didn't have to buy the supplemental insurance policies. But here again, you know, follow the money. ARP makes hundreds of millions of dollars each year selling their supplemental insurance, so they had a vested interest. Who can blame them in wanting to push through Obamacare when it means even more money for their supplemental policies? What I'm talking about is a situation where seniors can have a choice. You can have your Medicare. If you're on Medicaid, you can have Medicaid, or we'll give you a debit card where you're back in control of your own health care. Why not? It'd be cheaper. It gets back to a real doctor-patient relationship. It gets people back in charge of their own health situations. Well, the reason is because for many people, it's all about the GRE, the government running everything. The founders didn't want the government running everything. But once the government has control of everyone's health care, they have a legitimate right to dictate what you can eat, what you can't eat, what you have to do in the way of exercise, what you can't do in the way of physical activity. They got a right because they're paying for your health care. If they're paying for the health care, they have a right to tell you what you can or can't do. I do not want to live in a country where the government gets to tell me what I can eat or not eat, do or not do. Government's role is supposed to protect people against evil people or countries who want to take away their freedoms and liberty. In other words, it's addressed in the United States as providing for the common defense. That's what we ought to be doing. Then on a domestic front, our job is to provide a level playing field where everyone has an equal opportunity to pursue happiness. Nobody's guaranteed happiness. That comes in the heart. But everyone would have an equal opportunity to pursue it. That's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to be referees. We're not supposed to be the player referee. What a terrible game to be in, where the government's both player and referee. But I do want to give the President credit anytime I can. And he's been running around, even recently again, saying that, I believe it was last night I saw him talking again about Congress doing nothing. That's what Congress wants to do. Well, he is, again, got to give him credit, he's half right on that. Senate hadn't passed a budget in over 900 days. He's right. It's a do-nothing Senate. They refused to pass any kind of debt ceiling bill until basically the House passed one that was acceptable. We should have forced them to pass their own CR back in March, their continuing resolution, but they were negotiated with, and a bill was crafted that it appeared they could agree to pass in the Senate. Thank you. And what the country needs to see is what the House stands for, what the majority in the House stand for, and what the majority in the Senate stand for. And I'm not sure that people have seen that. But it means the House should pass what a majority in the House believes is best for the country, and then stand unmoved until the Senate passes something. Instead of trying to hit a mark that we think the Senate can hit, we pass what we believe in, as cut, cap, and balance passed, and then don't try to keep coming back and hitting a mark the Senate. Make them pass something. And then the rules, the law is very clear. This is all provided for. Constitution provides for these two parties. It expected there would be times when they'd pass a different bill from us. And then we'll go to a conference committee, and then a compromise is worked out, and then those of us in the majority in the House can say, see what we passed at first, like cut, cap, and balance. This is what we believe in. See what the Senate passed first. See this monstrosity. That's what they believe in. So in the next election, we in the House can say, if you want more of this kind of bill and responsible spending, not continued runaway spending, this is what you do. If you want the continued runaway spending, more and more and more taxes, then go with the Senate. I think there's some evidence to support that there are people in the opposition party who want to see the super committee fail. They want to see the massive cuts to Medicare. Not that that would never be said publicly, but we know that Pat Toomey, as he talked about yesterday, Jeb Hensterling talked about, two of our brightest minds on financial issues. We've got some really good quality people on that super committee, so-called. And Senator Toomey apparently had a framework worked out, and indications were there were Democrats who were agreeing that it was not a bad setup. There would be some people who would lose some deductions that would therefore raise revenue without raising the taxation rate. But in fact, the taxation rate would be lowered to a rate in the 20s, corporate tax in the 20s. But there would be enough deductions and write-offs that would be eliminated. It was actually going to raise revenue. One Democrat even said that was a huge breakthrough when that was proposed. Gave a lot of hope that something was going to be worked out. But then they talked to Democratic leaders. We're not privy to what was said. Next thing you know, there is no agreement. They're not going to agree to a deal. So you can't help but wonder if that's evidence that they really didn't want this bill to pass, because if the super committee came up with a way to cut $1.2 trillion off the budget over the next 10 years, it's only $120 billion a year, then people next year at the election time would really begin to realize just what Obamacare did in cutting $500 billion off of Medicare. But if there are these massive cuts to Medicare, then Republicans can be blamed before the next election, even though it obviously would have been them standing in the way of passing a bill from through the super committee. One of the things that should be a no-brainer, but apparently it's a no-starter, that is a zero baseline budget bill. Chairman Ryan has assured me and on television, and Speaker Boehner has said we're going to bring that to a floor this year for a vote. It's going to be passed out of the Budget Committee. I guess can't guarantee it'd be passed, but I sure feel strongly when it's brought up for a vote in the Budget Committee, it will pass. When it's brought here to the floor, it will pass. And that will end this ridiculous automatic increase in federal budgets that was begun by a very, very liberal Congress back in 1974. Same one that created CBO and started the ridiculous rules that they're bound by, that do not let them consider historic reality in scoring a bill, but only has to follow a formula that sometimes forces them to come up with a scoring that is completely unreal and not supported by history. Well, we've got trouble here, and it's not looking good for that getting accomplished as it should. People playing games in America will suffer. Book of Proverbs tells us that where there is no vision, the people perish. And if we don't get people getting a bigger vision, not only of where this country has come from, but where it could go, then the people are going to perish. And it's so unnecessary. Well, it was interesting meeting again last week with Prime Minister Netanyahu. He was appreciative of the House Resolution 271, provided a copy, which goes through a lot of whereases. Got lots of co-sponsors on this. And I hope if anybody is not on, that they'll sure add their name to this on both sides of the aisle. But the whereases include, whereas archaeological evidence exists confirming Israel's existence as a nation over 3,000 years ago in the area in which it currently exists, despite assertions of its opponents. It says 3,000 years ago. That was about the time of King David ruling in Hebron, and also the city of David. Just turns out archaeologically it's immediately south of the area where the current walled city is, and of course the walled city is over the area which was original Temple Mount and Herodian Temple Mount, and then hundreds of years later became of interest to people of the Islamic religion. And but it's actually much more than 3,000 years ago. But nonetheless, the bill says, whereas with the dawn of modern Zionism, the national liberation movement of the Jewish people some 150 years ago, the Jewish people determined to return to their homeland in the land of Israel from the lands of their dispersion. And so that means for people who are really wonderful, big-hearted people like Helen Thomas, but are just ignorant of actual history, Jews didn't come from Poland. They were originally in the Promised Land that extended from the Mediterranean to the Euphrates, if you go back and look at the promises made to David. Whereas in 1922, the League of Nations mandated that the Jewish people were the legal sovereigns over the land of Israel, and that legal mandate has never been superseded. Whereas in the aftermath of the Nazi-led Holocaust from 1933 to 1945, in which the Germans and their collaborators murdered 6 million Jewish people in a premeditated act of genocide, the international community recognized that the Jewish state, built by Jewish pioneers, must gain its independence from Great Britain. Whereas the United States was the first nation to recognize Israel's independence in 1948, and the State of Israel has since proven itself to be a faithful ally of the United States in the Middle East. Whereas the United States and Israel have a special relationship, friendship, based on shared values, and together share the common goal of peace and security in the Middle East. Whereas on October 20th, 2009, President Barack Obama rightly noted that the United States-Israel relationship is, quote, a bond that is much more than a strategic alliance, unquote. Whereas the national security of the United States, Israel, and allies in the Middle East face a clear and present danger from the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran seeking nuclear weapons and the ballistic missile capability to deliver them, whereas Israel would face an existential threat from a nuclear weapons-armed Iran, whereas President Barack Obama has been firm and clear in declaring United States opposition to a nuclear-armed Iran, stating on November 7th, 2008, quote, let me repeat what I stated during the course of the campaign. Iran's development of a nuclear weapon, I believe, is unacceptable, unquote. And we know that since President Obama stated it, he absolutely means it. Even though he said that the negotiations on health care would be on C-SPAN, be open for everybody, even though there were comments that he'd be focused on jobs like a laser, hopefully he really meant this. Whereas on October 26, 2005, at a conference in Tehran called World Without Zionism, Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad stated, quote, God willing, with the force of God behind it, we shall soon experience a world without the United States and Zionism. Whereas the New York Times reported during his October 26, 2005 speech, President Ahmadinejad called for this occupying regime of Israel to be wiped off the map. Whereas on April 14, 2006, Iranian President Ahmadinejad said, quote, "Like it or not, the Zionist regime, Israel, is heading toward annihilation," unquote. Whereas on June 2, 2008, Iranian President Ahmadinejad said, "I must announce that the Zionist regime, Israel, with a 60-year record of genocide, plunder, invasion, and betrayal, is about to die and will soon be erased from the geographical scene." Whereas on June 2, 2008, Iranian President Ahmadinejad said, "Today, the time for the fall of the satanic power of the United States has come, and the countdown to annihilation of the emperor of power and wealth has started." Whereas on May 20, 2009, Iran successfully tested a surface-to-surface long-range missile with an approximate range of 1,200 miles. Whereas Iran continues its pursuit of nuclear weapons. Whereas Iran has been caught building 3 secret nuclear facilities since 2002. Whereas Iran continues its support of international terrorism, has ordered its proxy Hezbollah to carry out catastrophic acts of international terrorism, such as the bombing of the Jewish AMIA Center in Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1994, and could give a nuclear weapon to a terrorist organization in the future. Whereas Iran has refused to provide the International Atomic Energy Agency with full transparency and access to its nuclear program. Whereas the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1803 states that according to the International Atomic Energy Agency, quote, "Iran has not established full and sustained suspension of all enrichment-related and reprocessing activities and heavy water-related projects as set out in Resolution 1696, 1737, 1747, nor resumed its cooperation with the IAEA under the additional protocol, nor taken the other steps required by the IAEA Board of Governors, nor complied with the provisions of Security Council Resolutions 1696, 1737, 1747. Whereas in July 2009 G8 summit in Italy, Iran was given a September 2009 deadline to start negotiations over its nuclear programs, and Iran offered a 5-page document lamenting the, quote, "ungodly ways of thinking prevailing in global relations," unquote, and included various subjects but left out any mention of Iran's own nuclear program, which was the true issue in question. Whereas the United States has been fully committed to finding a peaceful resolution to the Iranian nuclear threat and has made boundless efforts seeking such a resolution to determine if such a resolution is even possible. Whereas the United States does not want or seek war with Iran, but it will continue to keep all options open to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. And whereas Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said in January of 2011 that a change of course in Iran will not be possible, quote, "without a credible military option that is put before them by the international community led by the United States," unquote. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the House of Representatives, number 1, condemns the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran for its threats of annihilating the United States and the State of Israel, for its continued support of international terrorism, and for its incitement of genocide of the Israeli people. Number 2, supports using all means of persuading the government of Iran to stop building and acquiring nuclear weapons. Number 3, reaffirms the United States bond with Israel and pledges to continue work with the government of Israel and the people of Israel to ensure that their sovereign nation continues to receive critical economic and military assistance, including missile defense capabilities needed to address the threat of Iran. And number 4, expresses support for Israel's right to use all means necessary to confront and eliminate nuclear threats posed by Iran, defend Israeli sovereignty, and protect the lives and safety of the Israeli people, including the use of military force if no other peaceful solution can be found within reasonable time. Now, there's a bunch of co-sponsors on this bill. But we need a lot more. We need pressure to bring it to the floor of the House and of the Senate. Prime Minister Netanyahu's right. Sanctions won't do it unless Iran knows that the military threat is very real. They're not likely to stop. People keep talking about sanctions, sanctions. Yeah, if we just sanction the banks, if we sanction this, we sanction that. Well, the truth is, Russia and China have said they're not going to play that game. They're not going to get involved. And as upset as I have been with Russia and China over some issues, I'm grateful that they're honest about this. My concern was Russia and China would say, okay, we'll have sanctions, knowing that there is no better time to make an absolute fortune than when some sanctions are declared against a country that has something like oil. Because it means all the other countries that are participating in the sanctions don't get to benefit from any contracts, and therefore that means a bigger share for whoever wants to cheat on the sanctions. At least Russia and China have been honest and said we're not going to do the sanctions. So why in the world are we bothering these days to keep saying sanctions are going to work? Ahmadinejad has said, well, Madam Speaker, it's very clear Iran is a threat to the United States and Israel, and we should not leave it to Israel to defend the United States. We ought to defend ourselves and go after Iran and take care of this problem ourselves. With that, I yield back.